The county appraiser's note said the fishing camp was worth $1,100, not the land, not the dock, not the water rights. Everything. The whole 32 acres on Heron Cove, the falling-down fish house, the screened porch with the rotted corner post, the aluminum rowboat chained to a pine stump with a padlock so old the key had gone lost before Marin was born. $1,100. The appraiser had typed the number and moved on. The way a person dismisses a thing they've already decided has no value. It was the only asset on the entire settlement sheet that Dwight's attorney didn't argue over. So at 53, with $847 in a checking account she'd opened under her maiden name the week before she filed, a 14-year-old Subaru with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked when it felt like it, and no apartment, no job, and no plan that extended past the next 48 hours. Rosalind Marsh drove 4 hours north into the lake country of Minnesota to look at the thing nobody else wanted and figure out what to do with it. She meant to be back in the city by Sunday. She wasn't back by Sunday. Before we go any further, if you're new here, subscribe to Grand Stories, because what Rosalind found at that fish camp on Heron Cove is the kind of story that stays with you for days. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories reach. Now let's go back to the beginning. The lawyer's office had been on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, and the air in it had the particular chill of rooms where money changes hands politely. Rosalind had sat in a leather chair that was probably worth more than her car and listened to a man named Pratt read the settlement terms in the same voice a person uses to read a train schedule. Dwight wasn't there. He'd sent his attorney instead, a younger man with a good haircut who'd checked his phone twice before the meeting officially started. "He's tied up this morning," the young attorney said, not quite meeting her eyes. "He asked me to pass along his regards." "His regards," Rosalind said. The man slid a pen across the table. 22 years of marriage came down to a stapled packet, 3 signatures, and a drive to the parking garage. The house in Edina, the investment accounts, the retirement fund, Rosalind had helped build by following Dwight from city to city whenever his career said move. All of it stayed with Dwight under terms that Rosalind's own attorney had called hard but survivable, which she'd understood to mean. You could fight it, but it would cost you more than you'd recover. She'd signed where the tab said sign. There was one item at the bottom of the asset list the young attorney almost skipped past. Parcel 14, Lake County, Heron Cove Fish Camp. He glanced up. "Goes to you under the original deed. There's back property tax, 4 years of it. You'll want to address that." "What's it worth?" Rosalind asked. The attorney clicked his pen. "County has it assessed at $1,100. He almost smiled. Mr. Marsh felt the remediation costs alone outweighed any value in contesting. That was the most honest thing said in that room all morning, and it wasn't meant honestly. The camp was hers, because no one else could think of a reason to want it. Rosalind picked up the banker's box from beside her chair. Her mother's cast-iron skillet nested in a dish towel. A photograph of her father, holding a walleye the summer she turned 9, a coffee mug with a chip on the rim, that Dwight had been meaning to throw out for years. 22 years in a box she could carry with one arm. She drove out of the parking garage and sat at a red light with both hands on the wheel and nowhere particular to point the car. She had a sister in Phoenix who would take her in with love and without a word of judgment, and the thought of that, the kindness of it, the smallness of what her life had become, that a pull-out couch in Phoenix was the best option, made her eyes burn behind her sunglasses. The light turned green. She turned north instead. The drive took most of the day and changed the world outside her windows 3 times over. The city thinned to suburb. Suburb gave way to state highway. State highway dissolved into county roads that wound through birch stands and tamarack lowlands, going gold and orange in the October air. Rosalind cracked her window somewhere past Brainerd and let the north in. Pine resin and lake water and that older smell underneath. The one that lives in places where the light comes down differently. Slower somehow, like it has more distance to travel and knows it. She hadn't been to Heron Cove since she was 11 years old. Her father, Edmund Marsh, had run the fish camp for 30 years. Not as a business, exactly. He'd never charged a dime that she knew of, never put up a sign, never took out an ad. People came because they knew. A hand-drawn map passed from neighbor to neighbor, a phone number scratched on a napkin at the bait shop in town. Edmund would put them in the rowboat, hand them a rod he'd rigged himself, and sit with them on the dock or not, depending on what they needed. He never asked. He seemed to know. He'd died 18 months ago. on a November morning when the lake had already gone pewter with cold, and Rosalind had come up for the funeral and stayed 2 nights in the motel by the highway and locked the fish house door and driven home to Edina, telling herself she'd deal with it later. Dwight had said the carrying costs weren't worth it for a place that far out. She hadn't argued. She rarely argued with Dwight. That had been the arrangement, though no one had put it in writing. The camp road was unpaved, 2 tire tracks through second-growth birch that had reclaimed the edges in the years since Edmund stopped grading it. The Subaru bottomed out twice. Then the birch opened, and there was Heron Cove, a long arm of water reaching back into the pines, very still, going bronze in the late afternoon light. And there on the bank stood the fish house, small and gray, and listing slightly toward the water, as though it had spent 30 years leaning in to hear what the lake had to say. Rosalind sat in the car with the engine ticking and looked at it. It was worse than she remembered, and exactly what she'd expected, and something else too, something she didn't have a word for yet. The screen porch sagged at one corner. The dock had lost 2 boards. Lichen had worked its way up the north wall and was halfway to the roofline. The aluminum rowboat was still chained to the pine stump, but the chain had gone orange with rust, and the boat had taken on enough rainwater to be doing a slow impression of a submarine. She'd come to assess the situation, calculate the 4 years of back taxes, take a few photos, and find a number for a land buyer who handled lake properties. That was still the plan, when she climbed out of the car and crossed the dead grass toward the door. The plan lasted until she put her hand on the doorframe and felt how solid it still was. If you're still with us, subscribe right now and tap that like button, because what Rosalind found inside that fish house is the moment this whole story changes direction. Now let's keep going. The front door opened on its original hinges, complaining only a little. Inside, the smell came out to meet her, the way smells do in places that have been closed up and waiting. Cedar and old wool and the particular cold of a room that's been holding still since the last person left. The fish house was one main room, a pot-belly stove on a brick pad, a table made of 2 sawhorses and a sheet of plywood Edmund had sanded smooth, a set of wooden shelves along the back wall, and 4 hooks by the door at varying heights, as if whoever had built them expected guests of different sizes. A kerosene lantern sat on the table with a half-inch of fuel still in it. Rosalind looked at it for a long moment. Then she found matches in the drawer beneath the table. Her father had always kept matches in that drawer. She didn't know how she remembered that, and she lit the lantern and set it where Edmund had always set it, centered in the window that faced the cove. And the small warm light doubled in the glass and threw a yellow circle over the whole room. She didn't know she'd just done something her father had done every single day for 30 years. She made a fire in the pot-belly stove from the birch logs in the wood box because there was no reason not to, and it was getting cold. And she made coffee in the old percolator she found on the shelf, and she sat at the plywood table in the lamplight and tried to do the arithmetic of her situation. 4 years of back taxes came to a little over $3,000. She did not have $3,000. She had $847. She had a car that would need new tires before February. She had a sister in Phoenix and a pull-out couch, and the quiet certainty that if she drove south she would never stop being the woman who'd needed to be taken in. Outside, the lake made small sounds against the shore. She slept in her father's cot under a wool blanket she found folded in the cedar chest, and she slept hard the way you sleep when altitude or latitude or sheer exhaustion finally wins, and she woke before light to the sound of someone on the dock. Not footsteps, something lighter. The scrape of a tackle box being set down, the soft clank of a rod resting against the dock railing. Rosalind came out onto the porch in her coat and boots, and there was a girl in the low gray of early morning, standing at the far end of the dock with a spinning rod, not fishing, just holding it, looking out at the water the way a person stands at a window they've been staring out of for a long time. She was maybe 16, in a canvas jacket with the collar up, and rubber boots 2 sizes too large, the kind of outfit assembled from whatever was available rather than chosen. She went very still when she heard the porch door. "I didn't know anyone was here," the girl said to the water, not to Rosalind. "Who are you?" Rosalind said. The girl turned around slowly, the lamp in the window. "I saw it last night driving past on the highway." She looked at the fish house and then back at the water. "I thought it might be him." Then she looked down at the dock boards. "I knew it wasn't, though, I knew that." She didn't say who him was. She didn't have to. Rosalind made them both coffee, which the girl, whose name, over the course of a long hour and a great deal of silence, turned out to be Blythe, took with both hands like it was the most important thing she'd been handed in a while. They sat on the dock in the cold as the sun came up over the pine ridges and turned the cove from gray to silver to that particular northern blue that has no equivalent anywhere south of the 46th parallel. "How long did you know him?" Rosalind asked. Blythe was quiet for a while. She handled silence the way some people handle a thing they're afraid will break, carefully, without looking at it directly. "3 summers," Blythe said at last. She picked at the edge of the dock board with her thumbnail. "My mom was going through some things. She didn't always, she'd kind of disappear for stretches. And somebody at the bait shop told me that if I came down the camp road and the lamp was on, there was a man here who'd let me fish and wouldn't make it weird." She looked at Rosalind sideways. "He let me stay in the boathouse once for 4 days. He left a sleeping bag and a cooler with food, and he never once asked me to explain myself. He just came out every morning with 2 cups of coffee, and we'd fish, and he'd talk about the weather or the osprey nest on the far point. And when I went home, he didn't say anything about where I'd been or where I was going." She exhaled slowly. "Nobody had ever given me that much room before. Felt like a strange kind of present." Her name was Blythe Okafor, and it took Rosalind several days to learn much more than that. She was 17 now, not 16, and she lived in a house about 4 miles up the county road with her grandmother, who was not well, and she had been coming down the camp road since she was 14, because somebody at the bait shop had told her about a man and a lamp. Rosalind did not ask her to stop coming. She made coffee every morning and set it on the dock railing, and let Blythe arrive when she arrived and stay as long as she stayed, and she learned that some people can only be known sideways, in pieces, never head-on, and that the kindness is in not requiring more than what they can give. In the meantime, Rosalind started fixing things. She couldn't do the taxes yet. She couldn't do anything about the $847, or the cracked dashboard, or the question of what she was going to do with the rest of her life. But she could replace the 2 missing dock boards with lumber from the stacked pile behind the fish house, and she could clear the downspout that had been directing rain, straight into the crawl space, for God knew how many years, and she could wire brush the rust off the rowboat chain and drag the boat up onto the shore, and tip out the standing water that had gone green and cold at the bottom. The work helped. That was the plain truth of it that she hadn't expected. She had spent 22 years being a woman who consulted her husband. Before she touched anything structural, a woman who deferred and softened and said, "Let me ask Dwight," as if she'd traded her own judgment away piece by piece for the convenience of never having to make a mistake in front of someone who'd remember. Up here there was no one to ask. There was only the next board, the right tool or the wrong one, and the quiet private satisfaction of standing back and seeing something fixed that had been broken. Blythe started staying longer. She helped without being asked. She would simply appear at Rosalind's elbow and take one end of something that needed 2 people, and they would work together in the comfortable wordless way of people who are both better at doing than talking. The girl knew the camp the way you know a place you've been afraid to love too openly. She knew which dock board was soft, and where the good perch held in late October, and which birch tree had a wasp's nest that had been empty since August. One afternoon, recalking the boathouse window, the girl started talking without preamble. "He used to say the lake was patient," Blythe said, working the caulk gun in even strokes. "Said it would be there longer than any of us would be there. And that was either terrifying or comforting, depending on what kind of day you were having." She paused. "I had a lot of terrifying days back then. He never asked about them. He'd just row us out to the middle where you can't hear anything but water, and he'd say, 'Watch for the heron.' Like that was the most important thing in the world, and somehow for an hour it was." Rosalind kept caulking and did not ask anything at all. The girl seemed to know she was being given space, and she filled it slowly, the way a tide comes in. If you've stayed with us this far, do us a favor and subscribe to Grand Stories, because what Rosalind found on the 9th day, under the floorboard behind the potbelly stove, is the reason none of what comes next can be undone. Stay with us. It was on the 9th morning, moving the stove a few inches to true up the brick pad beneath it, that Rosalind found it. The broom caught on a seam she hadn't noticed. Too straight and too clean to be an accident of old wood, shrinking over time. She knelt and ran her thumb along it. The plank wasn't nailed, it was cut to lift. She worked the blade of her pocket knife into the seam and pried, and the board came up with a sound like a held breath being released. Beneath it, in the dry, cold dark between the floor joists, were two things. The first was a tin tackle box, the old green kind with the red latch, padlocked with a small brass lock. The second was a composition notebook, the black and white kind you'd buy at any drugstore, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a piece of braided fishing line. The oilcloth had kept it perfect. When she unwrapped it, the pages opened to her father's handwriting. Small, and left-leaning, and very deliberate, the handwriting of a man who thought about each word before he committed it. The first entry was dated June 14, 1991. She sat down on the floor and read it by the light through the window. A family came down the camp road today. Father driving, mother in the passenger seat not speaking, 3 kids in the back. They'd been living in their van since the plant closed in April, the father said. He said it like a fact, no apology in it. Gave them the fish house for a week, took them fishing every day. Mother didn't speak for the first 2 days. On the 3rd day she laughed at something and it startled everyone. They left Sunday with a cooler of walleye and the name of a man in Duluth who owed Edmund a favor and needed a driver. The lamp is on. The door's unlocked. Rosalind turned the page. The lamp is on. The door's unlocked. It appeared at the end of nearly every entry, sometimes in full, sometimes just shortened to lamplit, door open, as if Edmund had been leaving notes to himself, reminders of a policy he'd made and intended to keep. She read for 2 hours without stopping. The notebook was 90 pages and covered 11 years, 1991 to 2002. Name after name, reason after reason. A woman named Cressida who'd driven up from the cities in November and sat on the dock for 4 hours before she could speak. A veteran named Tommy who'd slept in the boathouse for 2 weeks and left without a word but came back the following summer, with a bottle of good whiskey and a handshake that went on longer than handshakes usually do. A teenage boy, no name given, just initials, M.O., who'd arrived on a bicycle with nothing but a backpack and stayed 6 days, fishing every morning quiet as Riverstone, and left with a thermos and a note. Edmund had written him that the notebook didn't reproduce. He taught them things. Rosalind could see that, reading between the lines. Not lessons, nothing formal, just the way Asa had done it, just the particular kindness of being shown that the world has patterns, and you can learn them if someone will stand beside you long enough to point them out. The osprey nest on the far point. The way the perch move when the pressure drops. How to read a sky at 3 in the afternoon and know what was coming by evening. She read an entry from 1997 about a woman who'd come up the road after leaving a marriage of 16 years with almost nothing, and she had to set the notebook down on her knee for a moment and look at the ceiling. Then she kept reading. The tackle box was padlocked, and the brass key wasn't in the oilcloth wrapping or the drawer beneath the table or anywhere she looked that first day. It nagged at her, quietly, for reasons she didn't fully examine. That evening, Blythe came and sat on the porch steps and didn't say much until the last light was off the water, and then she said, "He told me once he was keeping it all written down, so the names didn't get lost," he said. He said it like a name is a thing you have to actively hold on to or it goes. She picked at the sole of her rubber boot. I asked him what he did with all of it. The writing. He said he was keeping it somewhere safe for someone who'd want it someday. Then she went quiet in the way that meant she was done, and Rosalind let her be done, and they sat together in the dark that came off the cove until Blythe's grandmother called from up the road, and the girl stood and tucked her hands in her pockets and walked home through the birch without looking back. The key, it turned out, had been in the fish house the whole time. Rosalind found it on the 12th day, taped to the back of the photograph on the shelf, the picture of Edmund holding the walleye. The summer Rosalind was 9. The photograph that had lived on every shelf he'd ever had a shelf to put it on. The tape had dried to nothing and the key slid into her palm with a small dry sound when she lifted the frame to dust behind it. She sat at the table for a while just holding it. Then she opened the tackle box. Inside were 3 things. A second composition notebook, newer than the first, covering the years from 2003 to the winter before he died. A small envelope with her name on it in Edmund's hand. And a folded document, official-looking, creased soft at the folds from years of being exactly where it was. She read the notebook first, because she wasn't ready for the letter yet. The second notebook was fuller than the first. Smaller handwriting, more entries per page, as though he'd had more to say as the years went on, or had simply gotten used to saying it. Blythe's first visit was in there, recorded with the same plainness. Edmund gave to everything. 14-year-old girl, M.O. from up the county road. Knows how to fish, doesn't want to talk, good company. Lamps on. Rosalind ran her thumb down the page, over the words, over the initials M.O. She thought about a 14-year-old girl finding a lit lamp through the trees from a highway and having enough reason left to walk toward it. Then she unfolded the official document. It was a conservation easement, recorded with the Lake County Land Records Office in the spring of 2009. Edmund Josiah Marsh had granted the development rights to all 32 acres of the Heron Cove parcel to the Northwoods Heritage Conservancy in perpetuity. The land could never be subdivided, could never host commercial development, could never be sold to a resort operator, or a lodge builder, or anyone with a folder full of renderings and a number in mind. It could hold the fish house that stood on it, and one modest dwelling if a future owner chose to build, and nothing else, ever. By a covenant that ran with the land regardless of who owned it. He had done it quietly. He had told no one. And he had done it in 2009, 14 years before he died. She was staring at the page when she heard a truck come up the camp road. Big engine. New, the kind of truck that costs more than the fish house and the land and everything she owned combined. She set the document down and went to the door. The man who climbed out was perhaps 60, lean in a vest and clean boots, with the unhurried manner of someone who has decided how a conversation is going to end before he's gotten out of the vehicle. He looked at the cove, slowly, the way a person measures a thing they're thinking about purchasing. "Name's Callum Reed," he said. "Meridian Lake Properties. You'd be the daughter. Rosalind Marsh," she said. "This is my property. What can I do for you?" He let the pause land, then turned back to her with a steady, pleasant expression. "I made your father an offer on this parcel twice. Very fair offers, considering the assessor's number. He declined both times without much explanation, which I always respected, even if I didn't understand it." He paused. "This cove is the last undeveloped frontage on this lake. I've got 40 acres under option on both sides of you. I have a project designed, 26 lakefront units, a boat launch, a lodge. The whole thing sits right where we're standing without your 32 acres. With them, it's a development. Without them, it's 40 acres of timber I've optioned for no reason." He named a number, $45,000 for a fish camp the county valued at $1,100. Rosalind looked at him. She was aware of the folded document on the table behind her. She was also aware for the first time that Callum Reed had done a title search before he drove up this road. She could see it in the way he'd said very fair offers, in the careful quality of his smile. He knew about the easement. He had to. A title search would have shown it in an afternoon, which meant he wasn't here to buy buildable land. He was here to find out if she knew what she had. If you've come this far with Rosalind, subscribe to Grand Stories right now. Because the reason Edmund Marsh kept that lamp burning for 30 years is about to protect every single person he ever kept it burning for. Don't go anywhere. The parcel isn't for sale, Rosalind said. It wasn't while he was alive. It isn't now. Reed studied her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression just slightly, like a man recalibrating. "That's your choice, of course," he said. "But I'd encourage you to think carefully. There are outstanding taxes on this property. The structure hasn't been inspected since." He tilted his head. "Well, since your father stopped filing for inspection. A non-conforming structure on a developed lake can find itself in an uncomfortable position very quickly." He placed a card on the porch railing. "There are code requirements and remediation costs that tend to clarify a person's situation. Think about it. People always think more clearly about these things once they do the math." He got back in his truck, pulled a careful three-point turn in the clearing, and went back down the camp road. Rosalind stood on the porch until the sound of the engine was gone. Then she sat down on the top step and thought about the document on the table and what it meant and didn't mean. She didn't have a lawyer. She didn't have money to hire one. She didn't know what remediation costs meant exactly, but it had the sound of a number someone else would set. She went back inside and opened the small envelope with her name on it. She'd known she wasn't ready. She read it anyway. She didn't reproduce what it said for anyone. Not then and not later. What she did when she'd folded it back along its creases was sit very still for a long time. Then she lit the lamp, though it wasn't dark yet, and she set it in the window, and she thought about her father writing in a composition notebook for 30 years and never telling a soul, and about a teenager seeing a light through the trees and having enough left in her to walk toward it. After a while, Blythe came down the camp road. She stopped at the porch steps when she saw Rosalind's expression. "The developer," Rosalind said. "He came today." Blythe sat down on the bottom step. "Yeah. He came twice while your dad was here." She was quiet a moment. "Your dad ran him off both times, polite but final. Said the cove belonged to the water and the fish and the people who needed it, and not to any man's blueprints." Rosalind told her about the easement. The whole thing, the document, the conservancy, the date. 2009, 14 years before he died. Recorded without announcement, without explanation. Blythe was very still. "So he can't build," she said slowly. "He can't build," Rosalind said. "And any developer who's pulled a title search in the last 15 years has known that." Reed knew before he came up the road. Blythe looked out at the cove. "He wasn't trying to buy the land," Rosalind said. "He was trying to scare me off of it." She picked up the business card from where she'd set it on the step. "Find out how much I knew. If I took the money, he'd own it, and then he'd go to whoever runs the conservancy and make them an offer to amend the easement. It happens." She set the card down. "He was counting on me not knowing what I had." Blythe was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I know who runs the Northwoods Heritage Conservancy." Rosalind looked at her. "A man named Elroy Vance. He's been director since the 90s. He's the reason your dad knew about the conservancy in the first place. They went to the same church in Ely for about 15 years. She paused. "He's about 80 now. He's not going to amend that easement for any amount of money." Rosalind looked at her for a moment longer. "How do you know that?" Blythe looked at her hands. "He was one of the names your dad sent people to, when he needed someone to make a call for somebody. He said once that Elroy Vance was the most stubborn, honest person he'd ever met, and that there was no higher praise." Rosalind found the Northwoods Heritage Conservancy's number through the county land office in town, and she drove the 11 miles to Ely herself the next morning and sat across from Elroy Vance, small and very straight in a desk chair, with the watchful stillness of a man who has spent decades protecting things people try to take, and she showed him the recorded easement and told him about Callum Reed and the 2 phone calls the conservancy had apparently received from Reed's attorneys in the spring. Vance set down his coffee. He looked at the document, though she could tell from the way he looked at it that he already knew every word. "They called. Twice," he said. "Offered us a 40-acre parcel in the county to the east to release the Heron Cove rights. I told them no both times. Didn't require much deliberation." He folded his hands. "Your father placed this easement because he believed that Cove was the kind of place that does a particular thing for people who need it, and that if you let someone put 26 units on it, it stops doing that thing forever." He looked up. "Edmund Marsh was right about most things. I wasn't going to unmake one of them for 40 acres of cut-over timber." He leaned back. "Reed doesn't have a legal leg under him. The easement is recorded, it's clear, it's perpetual, and it is not negotiable. What he has is the ability to make noise about code compliance, and that noise is designed to cost you money and time and sleep, until you decide it's cheaper to sell." She looked at her. "So don't let it cost you those things. Come back tomorrow morning, with whatever correspondence he's sent or will send, and we'll write him a letter that ends this conversation." She came back the next morning. Vance wrote the letter himself, 1 page, plain language, the language of a man who has been making this specific argument for 40 years and no longer needs to raise his voice to make it. She drove back to the camp with the letter in the passenger seat, and the Subaru didn't bottom out once on the camp road, which she chose to take as a good sign. Callum Reed came back to Heron Cove one more time, 9 days later. He didn't get out of his truck. Rosalind handed him an envelope through the driver's window. The recorded easement, Vance's letter, and a photocopy of the county's title record with the relevant sections highlighted. She didn't say much. Reed read the first page, and the color in his neck changed, and he handed the papers back and drove away down the camp road for the last time, careful on the ruts. He'd come looking for a woman who didn't know what she'd inherited. He'd been wrong on that count, and the thing that beat him had been put in place, 14 years before he ever drove up the road, by a man who'd never said a word about it to anyone. The county found out the way things spread in Lake Country, slowly at first, through the bait shop and the hardware store, and the Saturday coffee hour at the Lutheran church, and then all at once when Elroy Vance mentioned it at a conservancy meeting, and someone who'd been at that meeting was related to a woman who'd once stayed in the fish house with her children the week. The plant closed in '91 and never forgotten it. They came up the camp road, not to ask anything, not to sell anything, just to come. A man named Trout. She never did get his first name, everyone just called him Trout, left a half cord of split birch stacked against the fish house wall. The woman who'd stayed with her children in the fish house all those years ago brought a casserole and sat at the plywood table and talked for 2 hours about Edmund. And Rosalind listened and gave her coffee and took every word like a coin she intended to keep. A retired game warden came up one afternoon, small and weathered, with a mustache gone white and a way of standing that suggested he'd spent most of his life outdoors and found indoors slightly unconvincing. "Your father and I worked the same Lake District for 12 years, he said. "He never told me he was doing this." He shook his head. "I'd have known, though, if I'd paid attention. There were always people down that road. Seemed like the kind of thing that just happened up at Marsh's place." He looked out at the cove. "A man keeps a lamp on, people start to believe somebody's home." He turned back to her. "That's the whole of it, I think." Rosalind walked him back to his truck and stood in the clearing after he drove away, in the October light that falls flat and golden in the north. And she thought about a composition notebook in an oilcloth wrapping and 30 years of names written down so they wouldn't get lost. And she understood at last what her father had meant to do with all of it. Not to be known, not to be thanked. To make something that worked the way good things work, quietly, consistently, without requiring that anyone notice it was there. He'd given away the development rights to a cove that a developer valued at something north of $2 million. He'd given them away for nothing and told no one, and the only explanation he'd left was in a composition notebook that said the lamp is on, and the doors unlocked at the end of page after page after page. Rosalind didn't sell the camp. She'd known she wasn't going to for a while before she said it out loud to anyone. She talked to the county about the back taxes and arranged a payment schedule with a clerk named Audrey, who'd known Edmund, and who processed the paperwork with a brisk efficiency that Rosalind chose to interpret as its own form of kindness. She took a part-time job at the hardware store in town, 3 days a week, which paid enough to keep the lights on and the propane filled, and left her 4 days for the camp, for the work that was always there, for the mornings on the dock with coffee and the long light coming off the water. She started a second composition notebook. She didn't make a ceremony of it. She bought it at the drugstore in town, the same black and white kind Edmund had used, and she brought it home and set it on the shelf and wrote the date on the first page and left the rest blank for now. She put her father's last letter inside the front cover where she could find it. She told Blythe about the notebook, and Blythe was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He showed me once, the hiding spot. He didn't open it or anything, he just showed me where it was." She paused. "I think he wanted someone to know it was there, in case." Rosalind looked at her. "He said the names were the most important part." Blythe said a name is the smallest thing a person can be given and still be given everything. She pulled at a thread on her sleeve. "I looked up my initials once, after he was gone. I drove down to see if I could get inside. The lock wasn't latched, so I got in and I found the notebook and I read my own entry." "What did it say?" Rosalind asked. Blythe was still for a moment. Then she said, "It said good kid, needs room. Already knows more than she thinks she does, give her time." She looked out at the cove. "I keep it where I can find it," she said. "What he wrote. I come back and read it when I need to." Rosalind didn't say anything. She understood. Some things are not completed by being spoken. The woman with the child came in November, on a night when the temperature had dropped hard, and the first ice was forming at the edges of the cove. Rosalind heard the car from the fish house, an old sedan grinding up the camp road in first gear, and she went to the door, and in the clearing stood a woman about 38, in a thin coat, with a little boy on her hip who'd gone to sleep in transit. She was looking at the lamp in the window the way people look at something they weren't sure was going to be there. "I saw the light," the woman said, "from the highway. I'm sorry, I don't." She looked at the boy and then at Rosalind. "I didn't know who else." "You don't need to explain," Rosalind said. "Come in out of the cold. There's a fire and there's soup and the cot's made up." The woman didn't move for a moment. "Why?" she said. Rosalind held the door. "My father used to get asked that," she said. "Come inside." She fed them and warmed them, and did not ask a single question that wasn't answered by the presence of a woman and a sleeping child standing in a clearing in the dark. In the morning, when the woman and her boy were back in the car and headed for a cousin's place in Duluth, Rosalind sat at the plywood table and opened the new composition notebook and wrote the date and a name, and what little she knew of the reason. And at the end of the entry she wrote the only sentence that mattered. "The lamp is on. The door's unlocked." Blythe read it over her shoulder. She'd started coming inside without knocking, which was a thing that had happened gradually, and without announcement, the way most important things happen. Your handwriting slants the same way his did, Blythe said. I know, Rosalind said. The girl went out to check the dock in the cold, and Rosalind watched her from the window. A teenager in boots too large for her, walking the planks with the easy sureness of someone who has finally found a place that holds still when she steps on it. And she felt the full weight of what her father had left her. Not the 32 acres, not the fish house, not the cove that no one could build on now or ever. He'd left her a lamp and a notebook and 30 years of proof that showing up quietly is enough, that keeping a door unlocked for people who haven't arrived yet is enough, that the good you do in the dark counts the same as the good you do in the light. Maybe more, because no one's watching to make sure you keep doing it. Rosalind Marsh had driven north with $847, and a plan that didn't make it past the first night. She had a cracked dashboard and back taxes she was paying down $40 at a time, and a plywood table that wasn't really a table and a cot, with a wool blanket that smelled like cedar and cold water. She had a notebook with 2 entries in it, and a lamp in the window, and a girl on the dock who'd finally stopped watching the door. And every evening, when the light fell off the cove and the birch went silver, and the osprey crossed the far point, on its way to wherever osprey go in the dark, Rosalind Marsh filled the lantern and trimmed the wick and set it in the window where it had always been, so that anyone coming up that camp road on the worst night they'd had in a long time would see it from the last bend and know. The way Blythe had known, the way the family from the closed plant had known, the way 30 years of people without another door to knock on had known. That this one was open. It always had been. It always would be. That was the whole of the inheritance, and it was more than enough.